The first time I met Andrew, my daughter Lucy's boyfriend, was at my husband's funeral. It's strange, isn't it? The way some of the most significant moments of our lives are tied to the most devastating. I remember sitting in the church pew, the scent of lilies cloying in the air, and thinking that the world had never felt so heavy. My husband, John, had been my partner for nearly 50 years. How does one even begin to navigate life after such a loss? Lucy had brought Andrew to support her, she explained, as she leaned down to kiss my cheek before the service began. He was standing a few steps behind her, his hands clasped respectfully in front of him. "This is Andrew," she said. "Mum, he's been such a rock for me these past few weeks." I looked up at him, my eyes red and swollen from days of crying, and he smiled. It wasn't a pitying smile, the kind you brace for at funerals, but a soft, understanding one that seemed to reach all the way to his dark brown eyes. He extended a hand, and I took it, his grip firm but warm. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Fletcher," he said, his voice low and gentle. "Thank you," I murmured, barely meeting his gaze, before letting go. I felt a flush creep up my neck, a mixture of grief and the strange disorientation of meeting someone new under such circumstances. The service was a blur of hymns, eulogies, and muffled sobs. I sat still as stone, Lucy beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly. Andrew sat on her other side, his presence quiet but steady. I noticed him out of the corner of my eye once or twice, his posture straight, his face a mask of solemn respect. It was a small thing, but I appreciated the way he seemed genuinely present, not just going through the motions for Lucy's sake. It wasn't until the reception at my house afterward that I had the chance to really take in who he was. The house felt suffocatingly full, friends and family mingling in subdued tones, their faces marked by the same blend of sadness and exhaustion that I felt. I had retreated to the kitchen, needing a moment of quiet, when Andrew appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, his voice startling me. I turned to find him holding a plate of untouched sandwiches. "Lucy asked me to see if you've eaten anything." I blinked, unsure how to respond. "Oh. I'm not really hungry," I said. My voice sounded brittle, like something fragile and easily broken. He stepped into the room, setting the plate on the counter. "I know it's not my place," he said, his tone hesitant but kind, "but you should try to eat something. Even just a little. Lucy's worried about you." The mention of Lucy brought a fresh wave of emotion, and I pressed my lips together, trying to hold it back. Andrew must have noticed, because he quickly changed the subject. "You have a beautiful home," he said, glancing around the room. "Lucy's told me so much about growing up here. She said you make the best apple pie she's ever had." I let out a small, involuntary laugh, the sound surprising even me. "Did she now?" "She did," he said, smiling again. "I might have to take her word for it, but she's very convincing." His lightheartedness was unexpected, but it eased some of the tension in my chest. "I'll have to make one for you sometime," I said, the words escaping before I could think better of them. He tilted his head slightly, his smile softening. "I'd like that." The rest of the reception passed in a haze, but Andrew lingered in my mind. There was something about him, something steady and grounding. He wasn't overly talkative or attention-seeking, but he had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room when he spoke to you. It was comforting, in a way I hadn't expected. That night, after the house had emptied and I was left alone with my thoughts, I found myself replaying our brief conversations. It wasn't just the grief that had made me feel so unmoored lately, it was the loneliness. John had been my anchor, the person I turned to in every moment of joy or sorrow. Without him, I felt like I was adrift in an endless sea. And yet, in Andrew's presence, for just a few moments, I had felt a flicker of connection. A lifeline, however fleeting. A week after the funeral, the house was still unbearably quiet. The echoes of footsteps on the hardwood floors, the faint hum of the refrigerator, everything seemed louder in John's absence. I tried to keep myself busy, sorting through his things, rearranging the flowers that friends had sent, but it only carried me so far. Grief has a way of finding the cracks, slipping through no matter how much you try to hold it at bay. It was during one of these long, lonely afternoons that Lucy called. "Mom, Andrew and I were thinking of coming by this weekend," she said, her voice light but purposeful. "We thought you might like some company." I hesitated, torn between my yearning for companionship and the fear of not being able to keep it together in front of him. "That sounds lovely," I said finally. "I'd like that." When they arrived on Saturday, Lucy brought a bouquet of fresh flowers and a warm hug, her presence as comforting as ever. Andrew trailed behind her, carrying a bag of groceries. "We thought we'd cook for you," Lucy said, her smile bright but tinged with concern. "You've been eating, haven't you?" Of course, I lied, though the truth was written all over my thinning frame. Lucy's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't press. Andrew gave me a small, knowing smile as he followed Lucy into the kitchen. "She's been planning this all week," he said in a low voice. "She worries about you, you know." "I know," I said, my throat tightening. "She's always been a thoughtful girl." "She gets that from you," he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. As they prepared dinner, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, drawn by the comforting sounds of chopping and sizzling. Lucy moved with practiced efficiency, but it was Andrew who surprised me. He wasn't just helping, he was leading, gently guiding Lucy when she hesitated over a recipe, or teasing her when she got flustered. "You're a good cook," I said to him at one point, the words slipping out before I realized I had been watching him. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression amused. "I've had practice," he said. "Growing up, I was the oldest, so I ended up doing a lot of the cooking for my younger siblings." "Did you now?" I asked, intrigued. "Lucy never mentioned you had siblings." "3 of them," he said with a laugh. "All younger sisters. I think that's why I get along so well with Lucy. I'm used to bossy women." Lucy, who was stirring a pot of soup, turned to swat him with a wooden spoon, her cheeks flushing. "Don't listen to him, Mum. He's the bossy one." Their easy banter filled the room, warming it in a way I hadn't felt since before John's passing. I found myself smiling more than I had in weeks, the heaviness in my chest lifting just a little. After dinner, Lucy suggested watching a film in the living room. "Andrew's always talking about these old black and white movies," she said, rolling her eyes. "Maybe you two can bond over them." Andrew raised an eyebrow at her. "Don't knock it until you've tried it," he said. "Mrs. Fletcher, do you have a favorite classic film?" I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Well, John and I always loved Casablanca," I said finally. He used to say that Rick reminded him of himself. Andrew smiled. "A romantic with a tough exterior." "I can see that." The mention of John brought a lump to my throat, but Andrew's gentle acknowledgement eased some of the pain. He didn't brush past the memory or try to change the subject. Instead, he seemed to hold space for it, and for me. As the evening wore on, I noticed something I hadn't before, the way Andrew seemed to see people. Not just in passing, but fully and deeply. He listened to Lucy when she spoke, even when her stories meandered or bordered on complaints. He noticed when I grew quiet, his gaze lingering on me just long enough to let me know he was aware. It wasn't intrusive, but it was present, and it made me feel seen. When they left that night, Lucy hugged me tightly. "We'll come back soon, Mum," she said. "Call me if you need anything, all right?" "I will," I promised, though I rarely did. She kissed my cheek and headed to the car, leaving Andrew standing in the doorway. "Thank you for dinner," I said, unsure of how to express the gratitude I felt for the small reprieve they had given me. "It was our pleasure," he said, his smile soft. "You take care, Mrs. Fletcher." I nodded, and as he turned to leave, I found myself saying, "Call me Helen." He paused, looking back at me. "All right, Helen," he said, his tone warm and familiar. "Good night." That night, as I lay in bed, I found my thoughts lingering on Andrew. It wasn't deliberate, not at first, but the memory of his kindness, his easy humor, and the way he seemed to genuinely care stayed with me. For the first time since John's passing, I felt a spark of something I couldn't quite name. It was small, quiet, and unsettling in its unfamiliarity. And it scared me. After that evening, Lucy and Andrew began visiting more often. Lucy said it was to check on me, but I suspected it was also her way of staying close to her father's memory. The house had been her home for so many years, and I think she found comfort in the familiar surroundings. Andrew, for his part, always came along without hesitation, settling into the rhythm of these visits as though he'd always been part of our family. At first, I welcomed their company in the way a lonely widow might, as a lifeline, a way to stave off the crushing quiet of my days. But gradually, I started to notice things, small, fleeting things that stirred something in me I wasn't prepared to face. One Sunday afternoon, they came over for tea. The weather was lovely, and we decided to sit in the garden. Lucy was on the phone, pacing near the rose bushes, her voice animated as she discussed something work-related. That left Andrew and me sitting at the small wrought iron table, the teapot between us. "I hope she's not always this busy," I said lightly, pouring a cup of tea and handing it to him. "She should be enjoying her weekends." "She loves her work," Andrew said, taking the cup with a grateful smile. "But yes, she tends to overdo it. I'm trying to get her to slow down." I raised an eyebrow. "Good luck with that. She's as stubborn as her father." He laughed, the sound low and warm. "I've noticed." There was a pause, and I found myself studying him more closely. He had a calmness about him, a steadiness that reminded me of John. It wasn't just his presence, though, it was the way he seemed to tune into the people around him, his attention unwavering. "You're good for her," I said, the words surprising me as much as him. He looked up, his expression softening. "Thank you, Helen. That means a lot." As Lucy's phone call dragged on, Andrew and I continued talking. He asked about the garden, about the kinds of flowers John and I had planted over the years. I told him stories about the early days of our marriage, when we'd spent weekends digging and pruning, laughing as we argued over where the tulips should go. "Sounds like you had something special," Andrew said, his voice thoughtful. "We did," I said softly. 50 years together, you learn to appreciate the little things. The quiet moments. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me. "You must miss him terribly." I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. "Every day." Andrew reached out then, his hand resting lightly on mine. It was a small gesture, but the warmth of it traveled straight to my chest. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't imagine how hard that must be." I looked down at our hands, my mind racing. The touch was innocent, but it felt different. It lingered longer than it should have, and when I finally pulled away, my heart was pounding. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about that moment more than I wanted to admit. I told myself it was nothing, a simple gesture of kindness, but it stirred something in me that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was a longing to be seen, to be cared for in a way I hadn't allowed myself to imagine since John's passing. Andrew continued to visit with Lucy, and though our interactions were always polite and respectful, there was a new tension I couldn't quite place. I began to notice the way his eyes lingered on mine during conversations, the way he seemed to make a point of sitting near me when we were all in the same room. It wasn't just him, though. I caught myself looking for him in ways that made me feel equal parts exhilarated and ashamed. The way he carried himself, the warmth in his smile, it all drew me in, and I hated how much it unsettled me. One evening, Lucy and Andrew came over for dinner. She had been unusually quiet, preoccupied with work, and Andrew had taken it upon himself to keep the conversation light. As we cleared the dishes, Lucy excused herself to make a phone call, leaving Andrew and me alone in the kitchen. "Do you need help with anything?" he asked, rolling up his sleeves. "I've got it," I said quickly, though I didn't stop him from picking up a towel to dry the dishes. We worked side by side in silence for a moment, the only sound the clinking of plates and the faint murmur of Lucy's voice from the other room. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "I hope you know how much Lucy admires you." I paused, my hands submerged in soapy water. "She's always been a good daughter," I said carefully. "She talks about you all the time," he continued. "How strong you are, how much she looks up to you." I glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "I think she gives me more credit than I deserve," I said softly. "I don't think so," he said, meeting my gaze. "You're remarkable, Helen." The way he said my name, the way his eyes held mine, it felt like the air had shifted in the room. My pulse quickened, and I turned back to the sink, focusing on the dishes to steady myself. After they left that evening, I sat alone in the living room, my hands trembling as I clutched a cup of tea. I told myself I was imagining things, that the growing connection between Andrew and me was nothing more than a product of my loneliness. But deep down, I knew better. Something was shifting, and it terrified me. I thought of Lucy, of how much she loved Andrew, and the guilt hit me like a wave. This couldn't happen. I couldn't let it. But as much as I tried to push the thoughts away, they lingered, pulling me into waters I wasn't sure I could navigate. It didn't take long for me to notice that my thoughts about Andrew were becoming more frequent. I told myself it was harmless, that I was simply grateful for the attention and kindness he showed me. After all, loneliness has a way of magnifying even the smallest acts of care. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. The realization came one evening as I sat in the garden, the scent of jasmine thick in the air. I had been pulling weeds, my hands caked in dirt, when my mind wandered to the way Andrew had looked at me during dinner the week before. It wasn't anything overt or inappropriate, but there had been something in his gaze, a warmth, a tenderness, that lingered longer than it should have. The thought made my stomach tighten, and I dropped the trowel, brushing my hands on my apron as I tried to steady myself. I couldn't let this happen. It wasn't just wrong, it was unthinkable. Andrew was Lucy's boyfriend, her future, and I had no right to feel this way. The next time they visited, I tried to distance myself. I busied myself in the kitchen while they sat in the living room, laughing at some comedy Andrew had picked on TV. Lucy called out to me a few times, but I made excuses, saying I had things to prepare for dinner. Eventually, Andrew came into the kitchen, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice as calm and inviting as ever. "No, thank you," I said quickly, focusing on the vegetables I was chopping. "Everything's under control." He didn't leave, though. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence filling the small kitchen in a way that made my pulse quicken. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, his tone gentle, but probing. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said, my voice betraying me with a slight tremor. "Just a lot on my mind." He didn't press, but the way he looked at me, soft, concerned, searching, made it hard to breathe. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me," he said after a moment, his smile warm but fleeting as he turned to leave. I let out a shaky breath once he was gone, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too quiet, and I cursed myself for letting him get under my skin. That night, after they left, I sat in the living room, staring at the framed photo of John on the mantel. It was taken on our 30th wedding anniversary, his smile as wide as ever, his arm wrapped tightly around me. I thought of the life we had built together, the love we had shared, and the promises we had made. "What would you think of me now?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "Would you understand?" The guilt was almost unbearable, but so was the pull I felt toward Andrew. It wasn't just about attraction, though I couldn't deny that it was there. It was about the way he made me feel seen, the way he noticed things about me that even Lucy seemed to overlook. It was about the connection I had been missing since John's death, a connection I hadn't realized I craved until it was right in front of me. The next time Andrew visited without Lucy, I knew I was in trouble. She had called to say she was stuck at work, but that Andrew would drop by to deliver some groceries she'd picked up for me. I tried to insist it wasn't necessary, but she was adamant. When he arrived, he was carrying a bag of produce in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. Lucy thought you might like this, he said, setting the bag on the counter. And I figured we could share a glass of wine if you're up for it. I hesitated, torn between the desire for company and the fear of what might happen if I let him stay. I suppose one glass wouldn't hurt, I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. We sat in the living room, the wine glasses between us on the coffee table. Andrew talked about his work, about his sisters, about the little things that made up his day-to-day life. I listened, grateful for the distraction, but I couldn't ignore the way his presence filled the room. At one point, he turned the conversation back to me. You don't talk about yourself much, he said, his tone curious but kind. What do you do to keep busy these days? I shrugged, feeling self-conscious. Oh, just the usual. Gardening, reading, trying to keep the house in order. Nothing exciting. I don't believe that, he said, leaning forward slightly. Lucy's told me you're an incredible cook, that you have a gift for making people feel at home. That doesn't sound boring to me. His words caught me off guard, and I felt a blush creep up my cheeks. She exaggerates, I said, waving it off. I don't think she does, he said, his eyes holding mine. I think you're remarkable, Helen. There it was again, that warmth, that intensity that made the air between us feel charged. I looked away, my heart pounding. You shouldn't say things like that, I said softly. Why not? He asked, his voice steady but tinged with something deeper. It's the truth. I stood abruptly, needing to put space between us. I should get the dishes started, I said, retreating to the kitchen. Andrew didn't follow, but I could feel the tension lingering in the air long after he left. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed his words over and over, my mind a storm of guilt, longing, and confusion. I knew I was walking a dangerous path. Every time Andrew visited, every fleeting look or lingering moment, felt like a step closer to something I couldn't take back. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than a passing feeling, a product of loneliness and grief. But deep down, I knew better. The turning point came on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Lucy had gone away for a work conference, leaving Andrew to stop by and check on me. He arrived with a bag of groceries, as he often did, and a bottle of wine that he claimed was a thank you for the homemade cookies I'd sent with Lucy the week before. You didn't have to do that, I said, taking the bottle from him. Consider it a small gesture of appreciation, he replied, his smile warm and disarming. I set the bottle on the counter, trying to ignore the flutter in my chest. Well, thank you. It's thoughtful. We sat in the garden, the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the flowers. Andrew leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine, while I focused on the glass in my hands, turning it slowly between my fingers. I don't think I've ever seen a garden this well kept, he said, breaking the silence. It's beautiful. John and I worked on it for years, I said softly. It was our shared project. Something we both loved. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. You must miss him. Every day, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Andrew set his glass down and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. You're an incredible woman, Helen. The way you've carried on, the strength you show, it's inspiring. The words hit me harder than they should have. I looked away, focusing on the flowers, but I could feel his eyes on me. I'm not as strong as you think, I said. I think you're stronger than you realize, he said, his voice low and steady. And I think, you deserve to feel that again. To feel appreciated. Seen. I turned to him, my heart pounding. The intensity in his gaze made it hard to breathe. Andrew, we can't. But before I could finish, he reached out, his hand brushing mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver up my spine. For a moment, I was frozen, torn between the part of me that wanted to pull away and the part that wanted to stay. I know this is complicated, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I don't want to make you uncomfortable. But I can't ignore how I feel. How drawn I am to you. His words left me speechless. I had spent weeks convincing myself that the tension between us was one-sided, a figment of my imagination. But hearing him say it aloud, confirming what I already knew, made it impossible to deny. "This isn't right," I said, my voice trembling. "Lucy." "I care about Lucy," he said quickly. "I always will. But this, what I feel for you, it's different. It's real." Tears stung my eyes as I shook my head, struggling to find the words. "Andrew, I'm too old for this. For you. Age doesn't matter," he said, his tone firm. "What matters is how we feel. And I think you feel it too." I couldn't deny it. The connection between us was undeniable, and in that moment, I felt the weight of my loneliness more acutely than ever. I wanted to push him away, to tell him to leave, but my body betrayed me. I leaned into his touch, my hand trembling as I let him take it in his. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as if we were both testing the boundaries of what we had just crossed. His lips were warm, his touch gentle, and for a moment, I allowed myself to get lost in it. The world fell away, the grief, the guilt, the fear, and all that remained was the way he made me feel, alive, wanted, and seen. But the moment didn't last. I pulled away, my heart racing as reality crashed over me. "This can't happen," I said, my voice breaking. "We can't do this." Andrew's expression was filled with a mix of longing and regret. "Helen, I don't want to hurt you, or Lucy. But I can't pretend this doesn't mean something." I stood, wrapping my arms around myself as if to shield against the enormity of what had just happened. "You should go," I said, my voice trembling. "Please." He hesitated, but eventually he nodded, standing and gathering his things. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I never wanted to make things harder for you." As he walked away, I felt a mix of relief and devastation. I had wanted him to stay, to hold me, to make me feel alive again. But I couldn't let myself go down that path. Not with Andrew. Not with Lucy. That night, I lay awake for hours, replaying the moment over and over. The warmth of his touch, the tenderness in his eyes, it was all consuming. But so was the guilt. I had betrayed Lucy, even if nothing more had happened, and the thought of what this could do to her made my chest ache. I told myself it would end here, that I would distance myself from Andrew and focus on mending the cracks this had already created. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The days following that afternoon in the garden were some of the longest and most tumultuous of my life. I carried the weight of what had happened with Andrew like a stone lodged in my chest. The memory of his touch, his words, his kiss, they haunted me, as much a source of comfort as they were of shame. Lucy called me the next morning, her voice bright and cheerful. She wanted to check in, as she always did, and I struggled to keep my voice steady as we talked about mundane things, the weather, her workload, the progress of the garden. But every time she mentioned Andrew, how he had been so helpful, how he had made her laugh the night before, I felt the guilt clawing at me. "I'm so lucky to have him," she said at one point. "He's been my rock through all of this. I don't know what I'd do without him." Her words cut deeper than I expected, and I found myself gripping the edge of the table, my knuckles white. "I'm glad he's been there for you," I said, my voice tight. "You like him, don't you?" she asked, her tone light. "I mean, you two seem to get along really well." The question felt like a trap, though I knew she meant it innocently. "He's a good man," I said carefully. "He seems to care about you a great deal." She laughed softly. "He does. Sometimes I think he understands me better than I understand myself." The conversation ended soon after, but her words lingered. I felt like I was unraveling, caught between my growing feelings for Andrew and the deep love I had for my daughter. It was a cruel irony, to want something that could destroy the very relationship I cherished most. Andrew didn't reach out immediately, and I was grateful for the space. But the silence didn't bring the relief I had hoped for. Instead, it left room for my thoughts to spiral. I spent hours replaying our moments together, wondering how I had let things get this far. I thought of John often during this time, his presence both a comfort and a reminder of how far I had strayed from the life we had built together. I found myself sitting by his photo in the living room, whispering apologies into the quiet. "I don't know what's happening to me," I said one evening, my voice breaking. I never thought I'd feel this way about anyone else. Especially not someone connected to Lucy. The house, as always, offered no response, only the faint creak of the floorboards and the hum of the refrigerator. But even in the silence, I felt the weight of John's absence more acutely than ever. The next time Andrew came to the house, it was unannounced. I had been pruning the rose bushes in the garden when I heard the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. My heart leapt and sank all at once, a rush of conflicting emotions leaving me breathless. He approached cautiously, his hands in his pockets, his expression a mix of uncertainty and resolve. "Helen," he said, stopping a few feet away from me. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, glancing toward the house as if Lucy might appear at any moment, though I knew she was still away. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said softly, turning back to the roses. "I know I shouldn't be here," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "But I can't stop thinking about what happened. About you." His words sent a shiver through me, but I forced myself to stay focused on the task at hand. "Andrew, we can't do this. It's not right." "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But I also know that what I feel for you is real. And I think you feel it too." I set down the pruning shears, my hands trembling. "This isn't just about us," I said, turning to face him. "This is about Lucy. About what this would do to her." He nodded, his jaw tight. "I care about Lucy. I always have. But I've been lying to myself about what I want, about what feels real." His words hit me like a wave, and I felt tears welling in my eyes. "Andrew, I can't be the person who takes that from her. I can't." He reached out then, his hand brushing mine. The touch was gentle, hesitant, and it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "You deserve to be happy too, Helen," he said softly. "You've spent so much of your life putting others first. Don't you think it's time to put yourself first, just once?" The words pierced through my defenses, and I felt my resolve faltering. For so long, I had lived for others, first for John, then for Lucy. I had accepted loneliness as my fate, never daring to hope for something more. And now, here was Andrew, offering me something I hadn't even realized I wanted. But at what cost? "I need time," I said finally, pulling my hand away. "I need time to think about what this means. For all of us." Andrew nodded, his expression a mix of understanding and disappointment. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll wait." As he turned to leave, I felt a pang of longing so sharp it took my breath away. I watched him walk back to his car, my heart aching with the weight of the decision I knew I would have to make. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet house, I felt the full weight of my guilt and longing. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The question now was whether I could live with the consequences, or if I was willing to risk it all for a chance at something more. The days following Andrew's visit were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. My emotions swung wildly, from guilt and shame to longing and a strange, unwelcome excitement. I tried to keep myself busy, throwing myself into the garden, organizing the pantry, even taking up knitting again. But no matter what I did, my thoughts always returned to Andrew, his words, his touch, the way he looked at me as though I were the only person in the world. I couldn't escape it, and I hated myself for it. Lucy called one evening, her voice bright as ever. She was in a good mood, telling me about her conference and how well her presentation had gone. "Andrew's been amazing," she said, her tone filled with affection. "He's been checking on you, hasn't he? He said he stopped by the other day." "He did," I said, my voice tight. "He brought some groceries." "He's thoughtful like that," she said, her smile evident even through the phone. "I'm so glad you two get along." The words cut through me like a knife. Lucy had no idea what was happening beneath the surface, and the thought of her finding out, of her discovering the feelings I was struggling to contain, made my chest tighten with panic. After we hung up, I sat in the living room, staring at the framed photos on the mantel. Lucy's smiling face, her arm draped over John's shoulder, stared back at me, a reminder of the life we'd built together. I felt like I was on the brink of losing it all. Andrew texted me a few days later, a simple message, "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, my heart pounding. I knew what I should do: ignore it, shut it down, put an end to this once and for all. But instead, my fingers moved almost of their own accord, typing out a response. "Tonight. After 7. When the time came, I was a bundle of nerves. I paced the living room, my thoughts racing as I tried to prepare for the conversation. I told myself that this was the end, that I would make it clear we couldn't continue down this path. But a part of me, a selfish, desperate part, longed for something else entirely. When Andrew arrived, he looked as nervous as I felt. He stood in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets, his gaze searching mine. "Thank you for letting me come," he said softly. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. He followed me into the living room, taking a seat on the couch as I perched on the edge of the armchair. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said finally, his voice breaking the quiet. "Helen, I know this is messy. I know it's complicated. But what I feel for you, it's real." His words sent a shiver through me, but I forced myself to stay composed. "Andrew, this isn't just about us," I said. "This is about Lucy. She loves you. She trusts you. And I can't," my voice caught, and I took a deep breath. "I can't be the one to take that from her." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I care about Lucy," he said, his tone earnest. "But what we have, it's not what I feel with you. She deserves someone who can give her their whole heart. And I'm not sure I can do that anymore." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and I felt tears sting my eyes. "Andrew, I'm not what you think I am," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm old, I'm grieving, and I don't know if I can give you what you're looking for." "You're everything I think you are," he said, his gaze steady. "You're strong, and kind, and beautiful. And I'm willing to take the risk if you are." His words broke something open in me, and before I could think better of it, I was on my feet, crossing the room toward him. He stood as I approached, his expression a mix of hope and uncertainty. When I reached him, I hesitated for only a moment before placing my hand on his chest. "This can't be real," I whispered. "It is," he said, his hand covering mine. "It's real." And then he kissed me. The kiss was different this time, deeper, more urgent. It was as though all the tension, all the emotions we had been holding back, had finally spilled over. I felt myself melting into him, my hands clutching at his shirt as his arms wrapped around me. For a moment, I let myself get lost in it. I let myself feel the warmth of his touch, the way he made me feel alive again. But as the kiss deepened, so did the weight of what we were doing. The reality of it crashed over me, and I pulled away, my breath ragged. "This is wrong," I said, my voice trembling. We can't do this." Andrew reached for me, his expression filled with longing and regret. "Helen, I don't want to hurt you, or Lucy. But I can't ignore this. I can't ignore how I feel." I shook my head, stepping back. "You need to go," I said, my voice breaking. "Please." He hesitated, his eyes searching mine, but eventually he nodded. "If that's what you want," he said softly. "But this isn't over." As he left, the house felt colder, emptier, and I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and I had no idea how to find my way back. The morning after Andrew left, the house felt oppressively silent. I moved through my routine in a daze, making tea, tidying the kitchen, and watering the garden, but none of it brought the solace it usually did. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Andrew's face, the way he looked at me, the way he kissed me, the way he left when I told him to. I had done the right thing by asking him to go. I knew that. But the right thing had never felt so agonizingly wrong. Lucy called that afternoon, her voice chipper and full of warmth. "Mum, Andrew told me he stopped by again yesterday. He said he was just checking in, but I hope you didn't let him be a bother." "No," I said quickly, my stomach twisting. "It wasn't a bother." "Good," she said. "He's been so sweet, making sure you're okay. I think he feels guilty about being away while you've been going through so much." Her words were like a knife, each one driving deeper into the guilt that was already consuming me. "Lucy, you don't have to worry about me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm fine. Still, I'm glad he's there for you," she said. "He really cares about you, Mum." I nearly dropped the phone at her words, my heart pounding in my chest. "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I avoided Andrew after that. When Lucy suggested they both come over for dinner, I made excuses about not feeling well. When he texted to ask how I was, I left the messages unread. I told myself it was for the best, that putting distance between us would help me regain control of my emotions. But the more I tried to push him away, the more he lingered in my thoughts. Late at night, when the house was dark and the weight of loneliness pressed down on me, I found myself replaying our moments together. I thought of the way he looked at me, the way his touch had made me feel alive again. And I hated myself for how much I longed to feel it again. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Lucy invited me to lunch at a cafe near her office, and I agreed, desperate for a distraction. When I arrived, she was already seated at a corner table, waving me over with a bright smile. "I ordered us tea," she said as I sat down. "And Andrew might join us later, he's finishing up a meeting nearby." I froze at her words, my heart racing. "Oh," I said, forcing a smile. "That's nice." She didn't seem to notice my discomfort, launching into a story about her work. I nodded along, offering the occasional comment, but my mind was elsewhere. The thought of seeing Andrew again, of facing him with Lucy sitting across from me, made my stomach churn. When he arrived, I couldn't bring myself to look at him. He greeted Lucy with a kiss on the cheek and me with a polite, "Hello, Helen," his tone neutral but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. I kept my gaze fixed on my teacup as he sat beside Lucy, the two of them chatting easily. But I could feel his eyes on me, his presence making it impossible to breathe. When Lucy excused herself to take a phone call, the tension between us became unbearable. Andrew leaned forward, his voice low. "Helen, we need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," I said quickly, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the table. "Yes, there is," he said firmly. "You can't keep avoiding me. We need to figure this out." I looked up then, my eyes meeting his. "There's nothing to figure out," I said, my voice trembling. "This has to stop." He stared at me, his expression a mix of frustration and pain. "Do you really believe that?" "Yes," I said, though the word felt hollow. "For Lucy's sake. For everyone's sake." Andrew leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to hurt her," he said softly. "But I can't ignore how I feel about you." I didn't know what to say. My heart ached with the weight of his words, but I couldn't let myself give in. Not again. When Lucy returned, the conversation shifted, the tension between Andrew and me hidden beneath a facade of polite smiles and casual remarks. But as we left the cafe, Andrew's hand brushed mine, and the jolt it sent through me made it clear that nothing had been resolved. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. The guilt, the longing, the constant push and pull, it was tearing me apart. I had to make a choice, one that would hurt no matter what I decided. But no matter what choice I made, I knew one thing for certain, my life would never be the same. The decision weighed on me like a storm cloud, growing heavier with each passing day. I told myself I had to put an end to the madness, to protect Lucy from the truth and to salvage what remained of my own integrity. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't silence the part of me that ached for Andrew, the part that wanted to believe we could find a way, no matter how impossible it seemed. One evening, I sat in the garden as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. The roses John and I had planted were in full bloom, their fragrance drifting through the air like a memory. I thought of him often in moments like this, wondering what he would think of the mess I'd made of my life. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this." The garden offered no answers, only the faint rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. But as I sat there, the weight of my indecision pressing down on me, I felt a quiet clarity begin to emerge. I couldn't keep living in limbo, torn between guilt and longing. I had to make a choice, no matter how much it hurt. The next day, I called Andrew. "Can you come over?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We need to talk." "I'll be there," he said, his tone steady but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. When he arrived, I led him into the living room, my hands shaking as I gestured for him to sit. He looked at me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe, his gaze searching mine for answers I wasn't sure I had. "Helen," he began, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Let me speak first," I said, my voice wavering. "Andrew, whatever this is between us, it can't happen. It's wrong. It's unfair to Lucy. And I can't be the one to hurt her like that." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I know it's complicated," he said softly. "But I can't pretend this isn't real. I've never felt this way about anyone, not even Lucy." The honesty in his voice cut through me like a blade, and I felt tears prick my eyes. "I care about you," I admitted, my voice breaking. "More than I should. But this isn't just about us. This is about her. And I can't betray her like this." Andrew's jaw tightened, and he nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I understand," he said quietly. "But if you're asking me to walk away from you completely, I don't think I can do that." The silence between us was deafening, and for a moment, I thought I might break under the weight of it. But then Andrew looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet determination. "I know this isn't easy," he said. "But Helen, you deserve to be happy. You've spent your whole life putting other people first, John, Lucy. When was the last time you let yourself want something for you?" His words hit me like a wave, and I felt my resolve falter. I had spent so long convincing myself that my happiness didn't matter, that it was selfish to even consider. But what if he was right? What if I deserved this, no matter how complicated it was? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can live with myself if I choose you." Andrew reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "Then let me help you figure it out," he said. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." That night, I lay awake, replaying our conversation over and over. His words lingered in my mind, their weight impossible to ignore. I thought of Lucy, of the hurt this would cause her, and the guilt threatened to consume me. But I also thought of Andrew, of the way he made me feel alive again, the way he saw me in a way I hadn't been seen in years. When morning came, the decision still wasn't clear, but I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to choose, not just for myself, but for everyone involved. And no matter what choice I made, there would be no going back. The day I decided to tell Lucy felt like stepping into a storm. My heart pounded relentlessly, my palms damp as I paced the living room. Every possible scenario had played out in my mind, her anger, her heartbreak, her disbelief, but none of it prepared me for what I was about to do. I had called her the day before, asking her to come over for tea. She had agreed easily, her voice cheerful as always. "I'll bring those pastries you like," she had said. The simplicity of her kindness made what I had to do all the more unbearable. When she arrived, I felt my breath hitch. She came through the door with her usual warmth, a paper bag of pastries in one hand, her smile lighting up the room. "Mum, you look pale," she said, her brow furrowing. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said quickly, though my voice betrayed me. "Come in, Lucy. Sit down." She followed me into the living room, setting the pastries on the table. "You sounded serious on the phone," she said, her smile fading slightly. "Is something wrong?" I took a deep breath, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "Lucy, there's something I need to tell you," I began, my voice trembling. "And it's not easy." She frowned, leaning forward. "Mum, you're scaring me." "What is it?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. The weight of the words caught in my throat, and I felt tears sting my eyes. "It's about Andrew," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Her expression shifted, confusion mingling with concern. "What about him?" I hesitated, the enormity of what I was about to confess pressing down on me like a tidal wave. "Lucy, something happened," I said, my voice breaking. "Between Andrew and me." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucy stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" she said, her voice sharp. "What do you mean, something happened?" I felt the tears spill over then, my hands trembling as I tried to explain. "It wasn't planned, Lucy. It happened. And I'm so sorry." Her face contorted with a mix of shock and anger. "You're sorry," she said, her voice rising. "Mum, how could you? How could you do this to me?" "I never meant to hurt you," I said, my voice pleading. "I never wanted this. But Andrew and we have a connection. And I couldn't ignore it." Lucy stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "A connection," she said, her voice shaking. "He's my boyfriend, Mum. My boyfriend. How could you betray me like this?" Her words cut through me like a knife, and I felt my chest tighten with the weight of her pain. "I know it's wrong," I said, my voice breaking. "I know it's unforgivable. But it's not just about what's wrong, Lucy. It's about what feels real." She stared at me, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "What feels real?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "What about me, Mum? What about my feelings?" Tears streamed down my face as I shook my head. "I love you, Lucy," I said desperately. "You're my daughter. And I know I've hurt you in a way I can never take back. But I couldn't lie to you anymore." She turned away, her hands clenched into fists. "I trusted you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I trusted both of you." The silence that followed was unbearable. I wanted to reach out to her, to hold her, to take back the pain I had caused. But I knew I couldn't. The damage was done, and there was no undoing it. "I need to go," she said finally, her voice cold and distant. "I can't be here right now." "Lucy, please," I began, but she cut me off. "No," she said sharply, turning to face me. "You've said enough." She grabbed her bag and walked out the door without another word, leaving me sitting in the empty room, the weight of her absence crushing me. That night, I called Andrew. "She knows," I said, my voice raw. "I told her." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "How did she take it?" he asked, finally. "She's angry," I said. "Hurt. And she has every right to be." Andrew sighed heavily. "Helen, I'm sorry. I didn't want this for you." "I didn't want it either," I said, tears streaming down my face. But I couldn't keep lying to her. She deserved the truth. "What happens now?" he asked softly. I didn't have an answer. The road ahead felt impossibly uncertain, and the weight of what I had done threatened to consume me. But one thing was clear, there was no going back. The days after Lucy walked out were some of the loneliest I had ever known. The house, once a place of solace and warmth, now felt suffocatingly quiet. I kept replaying our conversation, hearing the tremble in her voice, seeing the pain in her eyes. I had broken something precious, our trust, our bond, and I wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. Andrew called often during that time, his voice a lifeline in the emptiness. "Have you heard from her?" he asked one evening, his tone cautious. "No," I said softly. I don't expect to for a while. She needs time, he said, trying to reassure me. This isn't easy for her. Or for you. I sighed, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I just want her to be happy, Andrew. And I feel like I've taken that from her. You haven't, he said firmly. It might not seem like it now, but she'll find her way through this. And so will you. Andrew visited me the following weekend, his presence a balm to my frayed nerves. We sat in the garden, the roses in full bloom, their fragrance filling the air. For a while, neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. I've been thinking about what happens next, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. About us. He looked at me, his gaze steady. And what have you decided? I hesitated, my heart pounding. I care about you, Andrew. More than I ever thought possible. But I don't know if I can live with the hurt we've caused. His expression softened, and he reached for my hand. I know it's not easy, he said. But Helen, you make me feel alive. You make me feel like myself in a way I haven't felt in years. And I think we owe it to ourselves to see where this goes. Tears welled in my eyes as I looked at him, his words both a comfort and a challenge. Could I really choose my own happiness, knowing the cost? Could I let myself love him, even if it meant losing Lucy? Later that evening, as we sat on the couch, Andrew turned to me with a quiet intensity. Do you regret it? He asked softly. What's happened between us? I thought about his question, about the moments we'd shared, the stolen glances, the tender words, the way he made me feel like I mattered again. No, I said finally, my voice trembling. I don't regret you. His hand found mine, his touch warm and grounding. Then let's take it one step at a time, he said. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. The first step was reaching out to Lucy. It took me days to summon the courage to call her, and when I finally did, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the phone. She didn't answer, but I left a message, my voice thick with emotion. Lucy, it's Mum, I began. I know you're angry, and I don't blame you. I need you to know how sorry I am. For everything. I love you more than anything in this world, and I hope someday you can forgive me. Please call me when you're ready. The silence that followed was unbearable, but I tried to remind myself that healing takes time. She needed space, and all I could do was wait. Andrew became my anchor in those weeks of uncertainty. He was patient, understanding, never pushing me to move faster than I was ready. He listened when I needed to talk, held me when I needed to cry, and reminded me that I was allowed to want happiness, even in the midst of heartbreak. I'm here, he said one evening, his voice steady. For as long as you'll have me. His words filled me with a quiet strength, and I found myself leaning into the possibility of a future with him. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was truly living again. One afternoon, weeks after my message, Lucy called. The sound of her voice sent a wave of relief crashing over me, though her tone was guarded. Mum, she said. We need to talk. Yes, I said quickly. Whenever you're ready. We agreed to meet at a cafe near her office, a neutral place where we could talk without the weight of the house between us. When I arrived, she was already there, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. I sat down across from her, my heart pounding. Lucy, thank you for meeting me. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the table. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About Andrew. My chest tightened, and I forced myself to stay calm. I know I hurt you, I said softly. And I can never take that back. But I want you to know how much I love you. And how sorry I am. She looked up then, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. I don't understand it, she said, her voice trembling. But I want to try. I don't want to lose you, Mum. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her hand. Thank you, I whispered. That means everything to me. Our relationship didn't heal overnight, but it began to mend, piece by fragile piece. Lucy set boundaries, and I respected them, giving her the space she needed to process her emotions. Andrew stepped back as well, understanding that his presence in her life would be a long and complicated journey. But through it all, one thing became clear: I had chosen love, not just for Andrew, but for myself. And while the path ahead was uncertain, it was a path I was willing to walk, step by step. The weeks that followed my meeting with Lucy were a delicate balancing act. Our relationship, though no longer shattered, was still fragile, and I approached every conversation with care. I knew it would take time, perhaps years, for us to regain the closeness we once shared, but her willingness to try was a glimmer of hope I held on to with all my heart. Andrew and I navigated this new chapter, cautiously. He gave me space to repair my relationship with Lucy, stepping into my life only as much as I allowed. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I questioned whether the price of our connection was too high, but his patience and steadiness reminded me why I had chosen him in the first place. Lucy and I began meeting for weekly coffee dates, a tradition we had let lapse years ago, but now seemed vital. At first, our conversations were guarded, sticking to safe topics like work and the garden. But as time went on, she began to open up. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said one afternoon, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. "It's been hard. But it's helping." I nodded, my chest tightening with both guilt and gratitude. "I'm glad, Lucy. I want you to have all the support you need." She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine. "I still don't understand it," she said softly. "But I think I'm starting to accept it. That this is your life now." Her words felt like a balm, though they carried an undercurrent of sadness I couldn't ignore. "I never wanted to hurt you," I said, my voice trembling. "And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." Lucy nodded, her expression a mix of resolve and vulnerability. "Just, don't forget who you were before this, Mum. Don't lose yourself." As my relationship with Lucy began to stabilize, Andrew and I took small steps toward building a life together. We avoided public outings at first, wanting to give Lucy as much distance as she needed. But within the walls of my home, we began to carve out a space for our connection, a space filled with quiet conversations, shared meals, and moments of laughter that felt like a gift after so much heartbreak. One evening, as we sat in the garden watching the sun dip below the horizon, Andrew reached for my hand. "Do you think she'll ever accept us?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I hope so," I said honestly. "But even if she doesn't fully accept it, I think she's starting to understand." He nodded, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "I'll wait as long as it takes, Helen. For her, and for you." His words filled me with a quiet strength, and I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out," I said softly. "Together." The turning point came a few months later, on Lucy's birthday. She had planned a small dinner with close friends, and to my surprise, she invited both Andrew and me. "I think it's time," she said over the phone, her tone careful, but steady. "If this is going to work, we need to stop avoiding each other." The evening was tense at first, but Andrew handled it with grace, his respect for Lucy evident in every word and gesture. He made no attempts to overshadow the evening, instead focusing on making Lucy feel celebrated and appreciated. By the time the cake was served, the tension had eased, and I felt a flicker of hope for the future. As we said our goodbyes, Lucy pulled me aside. "He's good to you," she said quietly, her gaze softening. "I can see that now." Tears filled my eyes as I nodded. "He is. And I hope one day you'll feel that way too." "I'm not there yet," she admitted. "But I'm trying." Her words were enough. For the first time, I felt like we were truly moving forward. Over the next year, Andrew and I began to build a life together in earnest. He moved in gradually, his presence transforming the house in small but meaningful ways. The empty spaces left by John's absence were no longer a source of pain, but a canvas for something new, a reminder that love could evolve, even after loss. Lucy continued to grow into her own life, her visits becoming more frequent and her conversations with Andrew less strained. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and for that, I was endlessly grateful. One sunny afternoon, as Andrew and I worked side by side in the garden, I paused to take it all in, the warmth of the sun on my skin, the scent of the roses, the sound of his laughter as he teased me about my overly precise pruning. "Do you ever think about the past?" I asked, wiping my hands on my apron. "About how we got here?" He looked up, his smile softening. "All the time," he said. "And every time, I think about how lucky I am to have found you." Tears pricked my eyes as I reached for his hand. "I never thought I'd have this again," I said softly. "Not after John. Not at my age." Andrew squeezed my hand, his gaze steady. "Love doesn't have a timeline, Helen. It just finds you when you need it most." As the seasons changed, so did our lives. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined us. Lucy continued to grow into her own happiness, finding new love and building a future that filled her with joy. And Andrew and I embraced the life we had chosen, a life rooted in honesty, forgiveness, and a love that defied expectations. In the end, it wasn't about perfection, it was about possibility. And for the first time in years, my heart was full. If you've enjoyed my story, please leave your comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, where your support means the world to me. I look forward to bringing you more stories that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.